Hello, everyone. Um, Another video. This one I want to title Freedom for and the Will Not to. And as the title suggests, I want to discuss the question of the problem of freedom, the phenomenon of freedom. The concept of freedom is thrown around almost like a political football, and very important concept for ethics. In my personal view, freedom is perhaps the most important idea to try to think about, try to understand the most important phenomenon, perhaps. Here, I'm not gonna tell you what I think freedom is. Uh, Instead, I would like to give a few sort of guiding concepts, how you might think about freedom in a deeper way, but also I want to suggest how not to think about freedom. And this I want to really try to emphasize and convince you of. So the idea in this video, I'll go briefly through the Robert Nozick's comments on the experience machine, for which you wrote a reflection 3, I believe. And I just want to briefly touch on some of the ideas he has because this is relevant to today's topic. Next, I want to talk about what this is the essential point in this video, the idea of positive freedom. So, or freedom is in a positive sense of this concept, rather than negative. And I'll explain in a little bit what I mean by that. And also, I want to kind of give you a model, perhaps, for thinking about freedom, and including freedom of the will as well, in this kind of image. And that will be it for this video. So I'll try to keep it short, but there's a lot here I'd like to talk about. All right. So first, you've read hopefully the Thought Experiment, The Experience Machine by Robert Nozick, which he presents in his Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And there he proposes, imagine you could plug into a machine for the rest of your life, if you'd like to, that can sort of reproduce any feeling of what it is like on the inside to go through any experience. And of course, this experiment is meant to get you to think about what really matters, what is valuable, and whether you can reproduce it in terms of inner feelings, inner states, perhaps. And specifically to criticize the idea that somehow pleasure is the highest end in itself, as if I only had pleasure, that would be sufficient, because pleasure is supposedly some inner state, right? Some inner feeling. And so the thought experiment is meant to put a lot of pressure on that idea that happiness is just pleasure, right? Like it is for Mill, for example. So here's what Robert Nozick says: why not to plug into the machine? In short, the way to understand the way he puts it is, it's a sort of suicide. To plug into the machine is a sort of suicide. It's no different than going on a kind of morphine drip or something like that. It's just more elaborate, but it's a kind of everything essential about human life is pretty much missing within the experience machine. So then Robert Nozick points out 3 things that are missing, that are essential for human well-being, for the meaning that a human life can even have. And so I just want to briefly mention these 3 elements. The first, Nozick writes, we want to do certain things and not just have the experience of doing them. This is actually very subtle and very important distinction. Why the feeling of doing something, although is indistinguishable in a sense from actually doing that thing, In fact, there's something about the will, about intention, that can't be captured by this kind of, by a feeling or even a sense that we've done it. In the case of certain experiences, it is only because first we want to do the actions that we want the experiences of doing them or thinking we've done them. There's a lot to actually unpack in just that quote, right? It's our possibilities that we're actually realizing and that we are bringing them about. Not something else is bringing them about, but I am bringing this about. Without me, this would not happen, you see. And that is very different from an experience machine that sort of feeds experiences, even though you can't tell them apart. But I know that if I would plug into that machine, I know that I could never do anything really. So it's a suicide of my capacity to act, which is so essential to being human. So another way of putting it is that actions are irreducible to internal mental states or feelings, which are a form of mental state. The second reason for not plugging in is that we want to be a certain way, to be a certain sort of person. Someone floating in a tank is an indeterminate blob. There's no answer to the question of what a person is like who has been long in the tank, in the experience machine. Is he courageous, kind, intelligent, witty, loving? It's not merely that it's difficult to tell. There's no way he is. And it writes beautifully, actually, as well, I think. Nozick does. Here, very concisely makes the point, like, I don't just want to have experiences, a collection of archive of experiences that I might put up on Instagram. Right? I don't want to just have the experience of getting my degree. Right? I want to be a philosopher, or I want to be a professor. Think about what is required to become someone, to have certain characteristics. I want to be perhaps kind. I want to be courageous. I want to be intelligent. I want to be understanding. Well, those are not experiences that are sort of passively witnessed or undergone by you. These are, well, I'll leave it up to you to really think about it. What does it mean to be someone? In next week, we'll get back to this question. This is going to be essential. It points towards virtue ethics. Actually. I can't be virtuous or, I can't be good or evil in an experience machine. I have no moral standing in the experience machine. This is essential. And the point is, to be fully human, I have to be a moral agent in some sense. I have to be responsible. I have to be able to act also. But this is even further. I have to be able to be recognized by others as being a certain way. I won't dwell on this point here too much, but it is very important to think about. So the self is more than a series of mental states. You are more than an archive of stuff that has occurred to you. You are an active agent who is a person and is recognized as a person, recognized as someone who can stand responsible for their actions. A certain kind of self. So this is the second point. And last is the third, and many of you have pointed to this as well, and the previous ones. But Nozick writes, plugging into an experience machine limits us to a man-made reality, to a world no deeper or more important than that which people can construct. In other words, you're not accounting for all the mystery that we haven't even not gotten to, not scratched the surface of. We truly don't know what we don't know. We have no inkling about what is still there to possibly be known, to be understood. And of course, we have no idea how we would program anything like that. Right? So this is what he's saying. So there's no actual contact with any deeper reality, though the experience of it can be simulated. I mean, you could simulate being a scientist, making a new discovery. You'd say it's not real. Well, it's not real in what sense? It's not real because it doesn't actually go beyond what we can currently think about. So many persons desire to leave themselves open to such contact and to a plumbing of deeper significance. I mean, I would say if you're not interested in this aspect of life, I mean, just as an example, we don't know whether there's any intelligent life actually out there. Imagine a situation where the preponderance of evidence actually indicates that there is intelligent life out there, intelligent beings out there. How could you really even program that into experience machine other than through references to science fiction movies and something like this, which is still just our imagination. Now, if you're not deeply interested in that possibility, then perhaps you wouldn't miss it inside the experience machine. But I would think that if you're not interested, there's something really important missing from your life. I mean, it's not that you have to obsess about aliens all the time, but that sense of mystery about existence and about nature is an essential part of what it means for us to be human, fully human. And again, the experience machine destroys that. The way I want to put it, and this will tie into what I'd like to say about freedom, is that we do not know what is possible. We do not know what is possible. All right, so that's a little bit by way of review, a little bit of perhaps any of you can write on the experience machine in your final papers and dig into any of these points and sort of dive in and untangle them and so on. But now I'd like to move on. I want to pose a few questions first, and I'll kind of like orient your how I think about it or how you might think about it, and we'll have a chance to discuss it in reflections. But I'd like to sort of outline a few issues and say a few things about freedom. Firstly, this question, are you free? Well, I'll just perhaps say that maybe this should be an ongoing question, not one that you answer once and for all, one way or another, but something that you come back to maybe, yearly or monthly or daily even, to ask yourself, what would it mean for me to be free? Really? How do I experience myself as free or not free? How can I free myself from my anxieties, from my from my worries, from my doubts, from my addictions, right? From my prejudices, from my biases, from my ignorance? I mean, we can free ourselves from these, right? So maybe freedom is a kind of strange gradation, or maybe it spreads out like a tree into different possibilities of what we can become in the future. So it's worth asking yourself and keeping this question in mind, not answering it too quickly. Are you free? The second question is what I'd like to talk about today. What makes you either free or unfree? And the simple response, or not the simple, but the straightforward response is, well, if something limits what I want to do, what I want to be, well, that makes me not free. And if I get rid of those limits, then I become free. And this is true enough, but it's missing a significant branch on this sort of logic, a parallel branch that must exist. Just because you have no constraints doesn't mean you're free. And in fact, what I'd like to convince you of a little bit in this video is that without any constraints, you couldn't you couldn't be free at all. I mean, freedom wouldn't exist as a possibility even. I mean, even being unfree would be impossible. So the idea that freedom is absence of constraints, not having anything stop you from wanting to do what you want to do. It's a very thin and dubious conception of freedom. It's at the very least incomplete way of thinking about freedom. And this, I'd like you, if you think freedom is just not having anyone constrain what I can do, or anything, perhaps. I mean, wouldn't it be great to be a superhero, to have all these powers, that we can even defy laws of nature? But I'm not sure we would be more free even then. So let's keep in mind, what is it that makes us either free or unfree? And this brings to the next question that kind of often emerges, and this is why in the reflection I asked you to think about whether you could be free on a isolated, uninhabited island. Can a person be free within society? It seems like, if we want to live together and cooperate in some way, and to provide security for one another and not have to worry about being, killed or robbed or molested in some other way, then we have to place constraints on what others can do to us, to our property, to all sorts of things. And so, you naturally start thinking about ideas of justice and ideas of right and wrong and so on, just in order to exist within society, in order to be able to do the things that we sort of like to do: going to hospitals, going to schools, going to work, going to the beach, without having to worry about a lot of things, right? Because we have rights and others have constraints on them. And so in this way, as soon as you are part of society, you actually are less free, seemingly, than what you could be. So society and freedom sort of oppose one another. This is a unfortunate result, I think, of the previous idea, the answer to the previous question, which is, that constraints is what makes me unfree, as if all constraints were the same and all constraints were opposed to freedom. And so being in society or being part of society is somehow compromise already, because you have to sacrifice some freedom of yours. And this is I think also a misconception. I mean, it makes freedom into a very strange thing that, I don't even understand why anybody would want that kind of freedom, where as soon as you have to deal with anybody else and take their interests into account, all of a sudden you already have to start sacrificing your freedom, your personal freedom somehow. Well, strange way of thinking about freedom, actually, I think. Further, I'd like to think about another two questions just briefly, and this is just to kind of, I don't know, irritate your intuitions, or sort of, I don't know, prick your intuitions about these things. So, imagine a mosquito flying around my room, or a fly or something. Well, it has a basic nervous system, and, well, it's a pretty complex nervous system, a very complex organism, but nothing as complex as we are, right? But okay, it just flies around wherever it wants. It's doing whatever it wants. It flies here, it flies there, it flies, it senses some food over here, something else over there. It's not following rules. It doesn't have to pay taxes. It doesn't have to, take other beings into consideration. It's just trying to survive, trying to exist. Well, isn't it more free than us? Because we have to follow laws, we have to constrain what we want to do, and a fly doesn't. I mean, this is actually, it might seem ridiculous, but it's actually um, a serious objection to the just defining freedom as having no constraints on what it is that you want to do. Well, you might say a fly doesn't want to do anything, it just does by instinct. Okay, now we're getting somewhere because now it's more complex. Does a dog want something? Does a lion want something? Does a lion get to do whatever it wants? Um, And what is it, the difference between a lion, a squirrel, a fish? I mean, is there some more sophisticated way in which the wants and desires of a lion or a tiger work as opposed to the desires of a mosquito or desires of an ant? Maybe ants and mosquitoes don't have desires. Okay, fine. What about a squirrel? Does a squirrel have desires? It has a desire for a nut. It has a desire to bury it. It has a desire, you know. This is now very complex. Now, within all of that, how do wants of human beings differ from wants of lions, tigers? Is there something in the way of wanting or willing that human beings have that no other animal does? And maybe that's the relevant part that makes us somehow free or not. Well, this is now very interesting, and I'll perhaps propose something to you in this video, um, to suggest what is it that might actually be very unique to us. And even I'll try to suggest why. The next question is also, I think, interesting because now we are within the human realm, and if you've had the, I would say, misfortune of being in a relationship with anyone who is addicted, severely addicted, so I would say, just suggest to you that we're all probably addicted, very likely. I know I have a lot of addictions, actually. Um, they're pretty embarrassing. I'd like to get rid of them, but it's very difficult. And in a sense, uh, they're my addictions, and it's me. But I'm in a sense powerless against myself. But they're not as severe as an opiate addiction. And I posted a video of an interview with someone who is addicted to heroin, I believe, who was addicted to opiates, and a kind of conversation with this man named Keith that you can find on Canvas. But in any case, how do we think of freedom in relation to addiction? So consider this strange kind of maybe thought experiment. Imagine an addict, an opiate addict, with an infinite supply of opium. And they have good health care and so on. Right? So they're getting everything they want. Seemingly. Are they free? This is not unrelated to the question, actually, is a Socrates dissatisfied? Is it better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied? You might say, is it better to be a struggling, sort of uh, often depressed human being, working their way through life in the best way they can, rather than being a opiate addict that spends their life in just pure nirvanic kind of bliss? Um, we often think that drugs are bad because they're bad for our health or something. Well, okay, you have great health care. You can take opiates, and probably if you have good Medicare and you have all the time you want, you could probably live a decent lifespan. But there's something. It's like plugging into an experience machine, isn't it? Right? It's not that different. A kind of suicide of sorts, a very miserable one. Even though it doesn't have to be painful. Actually, it's there's much more pleasure than pain in that sort of existence. I wouldn't want it. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody else. And I think if when I see someone, I sort of pity them to a large extent because they're unfree, fundamentally unfree. Okay, so those are some kind of suggestive questions, and my own responses to the questions I posed in the reflection for this week. But now, what I'd like to do is introduce two concepts, a contrast. First, the idea of negative freedom. And it's not negative in the sense of it's bad, it's negative in a sense in which negative freedom refers to some absence of constraint, right? So it's a definition of freedom in terms of what is not limiting what you want to do. And this is the kind of negative freedom that we all understand. Freedom of speech means no one is there to shut you up. No one is there to beat you up or arrest you for saying something, that you want to say. Negative freedom, against, especially liberties and protections against rights against authority, especially government authority, right? You can't be arrested without probable cause. You have various rights. You're presumed innocent until found and proven guilty by a jury of your peers. So we have those rights. You have no one can interfere with that. No one can interfere with that. These are all really negative freedoms, right? Even though they're very elaborate and imply justice and so on. Now, again, as I say, this is an important part of what it means to be free. Someone who was born in the Soviet Union, I know a little bit about what it's like to live in a totalitarian regime that has violation of human liberty as its sort of core principle. Actually, it's part of its ideology, and we focus on negative freedom quite a lot, and rightly. The problem is if we only think that freedom is sort of defined through negation, what doesn't constrain what we want, right? So then we think freedom is just not having limitations on what we can do. This then becomes, if you only think that this is the only sense of freedom that is relevant, that was worth considering and worrying about, then this becomes a deep mistake, I think. And the reason is because there's another conception of freedom that is just as important, if not more important in some ways. But it gets neglected often because it's so difficult to think about. And by this I mean positive freedom. In simple terms, what do you actually want to do? So think about it this way. I'm in terms of negative freedom, I'm not free to rob a house, right? Because I would get arrested and I have all of these limitations if I'm found out. So I can't just openly go into somebody's house and steal something because, I will go to prison. But I don't feel like that makes me less free. And the reason is because the desire to rob someone's house is not part of my positive freedom. It's not something that I want to do. So I don't feel limited by a prohibition on robbing someone's house. You see? So there's a positive way of sort of starting to think about freedom. It's what I want to do in the first place. Before any of my desires are constrained or not, am I the source of my desires? And what are those desires? I would say someone who desires opiates every day is already less free than someone who doesn't desire them every day. Irrespective of whether they have access or any limitation to fulfilling their desire. And that's why an addict who has an infinite supply of opiates is not free in the positive sense. So the way to think about it is in two ways. You can be free from something, you can be free from limitations. When you're sick, for example, right? You have certain limitations. You have a fever, you can't do the things you normally do. You want to free yourself of the illness that's imposing this on you. But the question is, well, but what are you free for? You might say, well, I normally am free in a sense in which I have the possibility of going to play volleyball, for instance, and I actually have a desire to play volleyball, and I have the motivation to take the ball, call up a few friends, go on the beach, and play some volleyball there. That's all part of your freedom for something, the positive sense of freedom. It's in a sense in which it comes from you and you direct those desires. I really would like you to retain this idea of positive freedom from this video. I'll ask you on video response assignment to explain how you understand what positive freedom is. Again, here, if you only have a negative notion of freedom, then you can imagine how someone might be enslaved, but actually because their desires coincide with what they're provided for in their enslavement, that they're precisely the most unfree. Because their positive freedom is limited, not because their negative freedom is limited. You see, they're allowed to do precisely what they want, but they've been so raised perhaps in such a way that those desires to transgress don't form in the first place. So it's like, an animal in a cage that doesn't want to get out of the cage. There's no lock on the cage. It could get out. It's free to get out of the cage, but it doesn't want to get out of the cage. It wants to stay in the cage. That is a much worse cage in many ways than the locked cage, where an animal wants to get out but is unable to unlock the cage. Well, at least the animal is trying to get out. That possibility, that desire still burns, right? There's a freedom for. And then negative freedom is constrained. The cage is there. You can think of this as those who were stuck in the ideology of the Soviet Union were much more trapped than those who realized the intolerable conditions of that society and wanted to get out but kind of couldn't. We're stuck. So please, on your own, think about freedom for. I'll put it in another sort of way that might help further and connect it to what the models that I suggested I will try to give you in this video. You can think of freedom from as having constraints or not having constraints, and freedom for as having capacities for various things. So again, freedom for is the desire and the motivation to play chess. Freedom from is not having a chess set. Right? Or having a chess set. If you have a chess set, you are more free than someone who doesn't have a chess set wants to play. You see? That's one is negative freedom, having a chess set. You're more free if you have a chess set. But the chess set doesn't matter if you don't have freedom for a positive sense of wanting and having the motivation to play. Okay. I want to then further to make the point why the notion of negative freedom is insufficient to understand freedom fully or in the deeper level. I want to show how constraints and capacities are related. So much so that you can't have capacities, be able to do anything, to even have a desire without certain constraints or in place. So it's a much more intricate. We often think that if I'm constraints, if I have limits, then that means I have fewer capacities. There's fewer things I can do. Dispel yourself of that idea. It's simply wrong. I don't know how much stronger I can put this. And let me try to convince you here, and as briefly as I can, concisely as I can, that without constraints, you would not have capacities. As Nietzsche says somewhere, gravity is what allows us to dance. Without the constraint of gravity, the capacity to dance, the possibility of dancing wouldn't be possible. I mean, we can get into, you can dance in space without gravity or something. Okay, but I don't want to get into that that can of worms at the moment. So here's just a few quotes. Well, I'll put this up briefly. You can pause the video and read them if you'd like. This is Isaiah Berlin, a quote from his essay on two concepts of liberty, where he discusses this important distinction between negative liberty or negative freedom and positive freedom. It's this: what do you want to do for? What do you want negative liberty for? What are you going to do if you don't have limitations? And, in this quote here, Isaiah Berlin echoes what Robert Nozick was saying with respect to the experience machine, right? And here, maybe I'll just read this sentence. Isaiah Berlin writes, "I wish above all to be conscious of myself as a thinking, willing, active being, bearing responsibility for my choices and able to explain them by reference to my own ideas and purposes. I feel free to the degree that I believe this to be true, and enslaved to the degree that I am made to realize that it is not." I mean, those two sentences at the end there, you can read them several times and really think about every word that he's saying there. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but this is what he means by positive freedom. That I am conscious of myself. I'm thinking. I'm somehow a self-directed, responsible moral agent that thinks about who they are in the world in relation to others. So, in other words, I can only be free if I am a moral being, ethical, and to the extent to which I believe I am ethical, that's the extent to which I am free. I mean, this is a very profound, I think, idea here. And going before Isaiah Berlin was this 20th century British philosopher, I want to quote something from Friedrich Nietzsche. From Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's a kind of exchange, and it captures the essence of this freedom for. That's really such a slippery phenomenon, and such a difficult thing to trace out what we mean by positive sense of freedom, that I'm free to somehow be myself, or perhaps fail to be myself, really. So this is what Nietzsche writes in this kind of exchange of Zarathustra with a student. So this is Zarathustra says to the student: "Free do you call yourself? Your ruling thought would I hear of, and not that you have escaped from a yoke. Don't tell me, in other words, that you simply aren't bound by anything, that you're somehow unconstrained and unlimited. That's just negative freedom. Are you one entitled to escape from a yoke? Many a one has cast away his final worth when he has cast away his servitude." And that's powerful. And I invite you to read that one carefully. But then further, Zarathustra says, "Free from what? What does that matter to Zarathustra? Clearly, however, shall your eye show me. Free for what? What is it that you set as the highest good for yourself? What is it that you stand for in your life? What is it that you want to live for? And don't tell me just pleasure. And don't tell me just happiness. Right? Don't tell me just a story. Your eyes need to tell me what you exist for, what motivates you in life, really from the depth of your being, so to speak. I mean, we tell all sorts of stories why we do what we do. Uh, but then that doesn't explain perhaps even half of the things that we do that we wouldn't say to others because we would be too embarrassed. Right? But that actually does show what we're free for, what we really truly experience our positive freedom as. So now for the argument why without constraints there could be no capacities. And this is maybe a kind of going a little bit sideways in the way this argument I'd like to propose it. I gave you this kind of existential, perhaps, argument from Nietzsche and a few quotes from Isaiah Berlin. But here I want to tack in a different direction. What is the relation between constraints and capacities? First, here's a straightforward observation. Constraining certain possibilities can open up other capacities and possibilities. So it's not so clear that if you constrain something, that you actually just limit what it can do. It often works in the opposite. It just depends on the kind of constraints you're talking about. So let me give you a straightforward example. Consider two objects. One is a gas tank, right? Fill it with whatever gas you'd like, rocket fuel if you want. And here's an actual shuttle or a rocket, a huge, basically, container of fuel. Now, what is the difference between the two? One is a canister, and the other one is basically a much more sophisticated canister full of fuel. Both sort of explode. I mean, right? The canister can explode, and the rocket really is just a big explosion. What is the difference now between those two? One flies into space, the other one, if improperly kind of used, explodes. One explodes, and the difference is obvious. The first, the canister, explodes in every which way, and it has this capacity to explode, but it explodes in a sort of unconstrained way. Right? I mean, the difference between a shuttle and a gas container is that the shuttle is a very controlled explosion, right? It happens at a certain pace over a duration, and the amount of energy released is very much controlled. That's what makes one system, the shuttle, so much more complex than the gas canister. Now, the reason why the shuttle has the capacity to fly into orbit, and the canister just goes all over the place and can just does damage, is because of the constraints that exist in the gas canister versus the ones that exist in the shuttle. And the ones in the shuttle are very precise, and there are many more constraints in the shuttle than there are in the gas tank. This is the key point. So just because you have more constraints doesn't mean you have fewer possibilities, fewer capacities, right? In a sense, you open up new possibilities as you add on constraints, but the constraints have to be organized in such a way that to make certain possibilities even available and other possibilities more likely and other possibilities unlikely at all. So in order for the shuttle to fly, you have to actually constrain all the ways in which it can just simply explode. Those possibilities are constrained in order to open up other capacities to fly to into space. So I hope that isn't too sort of off field or elaborate or strange of an argument. Um, the point I want to make is that constraining certain possibilities can open up other capacities and possibilities to work, to think, to act. This is true about the shuttle. This is true about you and me as well. And the further point then is freedom cannot simply mean absence of constraints on one's desires or on what one can do. And here is a kind of better, maybe more persuasive argument, because I really want this to stick, to be, you want to convince you of this. Think of something very essential to human beings, which is language. The language we speak, English, let's say. Well, English has all sorts of constraints, and they're so elaborate. All the different, uh, you know, syllables that you can put together in different ways, and all the words and how those go together into grammatically proper sentences, and so on and so forth. There's so many, and how just you use words and what the words mean. All of that follows rules and constraints and norms and accepted patterns and all of this elaborate stuff, right? These are all constraints on the ways in which even you can think. At the same time, it opens up all sorts of capacities to plan your life, to have conversations, and so on. Language sets constraints on relations of objects in your experience, actually. And, I won't make a full argument here, but I mean, there's an argument to be made that even what color words you use will affect your perception of colors. And this is sort of on the edges of how deep language actually goes to shaping our perception and experience. At the same time, language makes possible abstract and hypothetical thought. You can think of unicorns. You can think of, going into space. You can think of stories that haven't been written yet. Language sets constraints on brain architecture. Language shapes our connections in our brain constantly, daily, actually. So you would think it's actually a constraint on your brain. Language doesn't add neurons. It actually emphasizes certain neurons and lets others die. At the same time, the result of that is a more developed cortex, frontal cortex and other parts of the brain that then coordinate their activity in such a way that you precisely don't just act impulsively. You don't just go on feeling. You don't just go on instinct. You don't just do whatever your momentary carnal desires appetites might venture to get you to do. You by constraining a lot of your impulses, you actually open possibilities of further cultivation and experiences of all sorts of feelings that wouldn't be accessible to you if you didn't have these other constraints. So the idea is constraints allow for capacities to open up. It depends which constraints, what they constrain, and how they work together, and what possibilities actually become available. So it's a much more complex issue of how that interacts. So to say freedom is simply not having constraints annihilates all ideas of positive freedom for more cultivated, more complex, more elaborate ways of acting, thinking, feeling, and so on. So here's then a kind of model or an image for how to think about freedom. Imagine this is yourself. But the way I'd like to suggest to think about this is the following. Think of your around you. I mean, we won't get into here kind of what a self is, although that is a very important idea here. But you yourself is not just, you don't just stop at the surface of your skin. In a sense, you are what you can do, your capacities that are sort of inside of you, but have to be expressed in the world, right? You have the capacity to ride a bike. You have a capacity to write a poem. You have the capacity, perhaps, to do other things, and that is part of who you are. It's a kind of horizon of your possibilities. Now, at any given moment, there's all sorts of constraints on what you can do. I mean, the physical constraints of gravity, of you need energy, you need, all sorts of abide by all sorts of physical laws. Of course, there are biochemical constraints on you. You need oxygen, you need all sorts of nutrients. Right? There are also physiological ones having to do with right bodily functions. There are even constraints that are psychological. So if you think about, you might have certain desires that you might have certain desires that are sort of, through, who knows, a kind of instinct or just developed in other ways that you have, in a sense, very little control over, even knowledge of. I mean, it's possible. And this is a kind of constraint because it limits what you actually do in your life. Right? So that's a kind of constraint. There are social constraints, of course. Right? There are laws. There are, all sorts of norms of behavior. Improper, right, wrong, just, unjust, all of those things now concern that limitation, that sort of limit of what you can do, limit of your positive freedom is what I'm saying. And of course, those are themselves informed by cultural, all sorts of ideas about value and the tradition of ethical traditions that sort of, also constrain us in what we can do and feel and think and believe. What's interesting about these constraints is that, while there are all sorts of other constraints you might think of, right? So think of this self and this horizon of possibility as constantly constrained by external forces, if you like, or sort of forces that aren't, in a sense, a full part of you. The interesting point I want to make here is further way to think about it is that culture constrains society. Society constrains psychology. Psychology, in some ways, constrains physiology. I mean, thinking that something is wrong to do and some sexual act without the other's permission. I mean, if you understand that that's a wrong thing to do, it's rape, in fact, or actually sexual harassment, well, then you might have certain physiological urges, but you know about them and you just simply deny yourself them any expression in any kind of action, right? So you just don't do it even if you have an impulse. So this is a psychological constraint on your physiological internal processes in your body. This and further constraints biochemistry. I mean, we don't understand how all of these things interact and work, but I think it's important to realize that there's a very interesting sort of layering at work in a self like you and I am, this weird biochemical, cultural, physical being, conscious being. And there's constraints on physics as well, and that is even further afield, but very important and interesting, of course, as well. Now, of course, if there were only these external sort of forces pushing on top of us, then the horizon of what we can do would simply collapse onto us. We would be enslaved by society, by culture, by our psychology, even by our physiology. But of course, there are forces in the other direction, and these are the capacities. These are what we can do with ourselves, and in a sense, deeper sense, It is who we are. We are these capacities. And they come in many different, also sort of layers or forms. We have the capacity to think, to have ideas. We have the capacity to act in various ways. We have the capacity to we have certain habits uh, of brushing our teeth, going to work, going to class, reading books, cooking. There's all sorts of habits that we have that are actually very important capacities that allow us to regulate our moods, regulate our feelings, regulate our thoughts, regulate our actions. There are further desires and appetites that are sort of pushing against these external constraints. And of course, instincts are what we have from the very beginning. We're as soon as we're born, or even before we're born, we're already trying to, sustain ourselves. We're trying to develop our capacities, right? And this is all. So think of this horizon of your possibilities as this kind of fluctuating um, horizon, fluctuating limit. And there's always forces on both sides. Sometimes you feel small and there's very little you can do and feel powerless. At other times you learn, you develop yourself and you feel like you can do anything, or you do a lot, and you have this self-belief or confidence. The interesting thing, and this is what I want to indicate, that there's another sort of further complexity on things. I don't want to dwell too much on it, but it is so very important that sometimes what we do is these weird arrows, where what we do is we freely set a limitations on what we do. What does this look like? So the way it looks like is something like this. You give yourself a principle. You say to yourself, I will never smoke again. I'm a smoker. I will never smoke again. And you have the idea of the importance of your health to you. And, maybe at the beginning, 8 times out of 10, you still grab that cigarette and you smoke it, and you actually do what you want. But in a sense, the weird thing about addiction to something like cigarettes is that you want to do what you don't want to do, right? On the one hand, you want to smoke a cigarette. That's the desire, that's the appetite. But on another level, you don't want to smoke that cigarette. So what you really want is to set a limitation on what you can do. You want to limit your ability to act on your desire, on your appetite for tobacco. So it's a weird kind of self-limiting act. One way to think about it further is promising someone to do something. You are freely setting a constraint on yourself. You are freely putting yourself in a position so that another person has the right to hold you responsible for what you promised to do. I promise to care and love and respect and whatever the vows are in marriage, right? Well, now our spouse has a certain power over us in a certain way, or we have certain obligations, have certain rights. We promise to do these things. And if we're not doing them, then we're what? We are more free? Well, it depends. I mean, why would you say we're in a sense? I mean, to say that entering a marriage makes you unfree, makes you enslaved. Well, I mean, it depends who you marry, I guess. If you marry someone who is who what is bad for you, constrains who you are, who you want to really be, well then yeah, you've now trapped yourself. But what you wanted it for, that's negative freedom, right? So your negative freedom was taken away. But the reason why it could be bad is because there's a positive freedom that you can do more now. But that just depends on the kind of marriage. I mean, we can think of a different scenario where your part, the love of your life, the person you marry and who you commit to until death do you part, is the one person that understands you better than anyone in the world. It's the person you can always turn to, no matter what it is that you're feeling. It's the person that uh, you want to see when you go to sleep and wake up to. And maybe, you know, you might be doubtful and unsure the first year, two, three, five of your relationship, of your marriage. But if that persists and you're married for 30 years and you still wake up next to, your person, and you feel like you're more you because they're there with you, waking up next to you. Well, I think that's maybe the freest a human being can be. I don't think a human being can be fully free or fully a human being on an isolated island without anyone to love and without anyone else to be loved by. That's not freedom to me. That's isolation. That's, solitude. Maybe those things are good for something. Um, in any case, the point is there's this weird capacity we have. We have the capacity to constrain our own capacities. So I'll give you this model. I want to give you this model to think about, but I want to then complicate it a little bit more, just a little bit more, if it wasn't complicated enough. Well, the one thing I want to add is of course what you can do sort of expands and grows if you're lucky, I guess, or if you're capable. As you get older, there's more and more stuff you can do. There's more stuff you can feel. There's more, well, sometimes we lose things and we can't feel things that we did feel when we were children, and that we're more impoverished in many ways. But maybe you can retain those sort of passions of childhood and actually just cultivate them. That's ideal. And you cultivate them into real capacities. And you push back on all the constraints, the social, the psychological, the physiological, and you keep, by restraining yourself, by staying disciplined, by thinking about things, by understanding what is worth doing and what isn't. You cultivate your freedom for something. And that way you expand your horizon to where in some ways you are the most you, okay? The most authentically you. So it's a developmental process, in other words. Freedom and development are very much related, I believe, concepts. It's a kind of freedom for is a kind of growth. And this this is a popular concept in our culture, like, self-cultivation. Yes, in a way, but I think that process is very much corrupted in our societies by various means. In any case, I'll leave it up to you to decide what your conception of freedom for, what it is that you live for, what is your good that you place for yourself that constrains you and thereby also opens possibilities to be. That's for you to think about and decide, but I want to give these, I want to eliminate some bad ways of thinking about it. And again, the bad way to think about it is to think that, if I only didn't have any constraints, whether social, cultural, psychological, physiological, biochemical, if I didn't have any constraints, then I would be Dr. Manhattan or something, playing God or Rick Sanchez or something. Well, listen, it depends on which constraints you get rid of. Right? It's nice to be able to dance at the speed of light without exploding, but that's either a miracle or there's something about nature we definitely don't know. In any case, right? It's not just any constraint that you want to get rid of. You want to get rid of very specific constraints. You want to maybe get rid of the constraint of deterioration of your biological of your body, and that will make you immortal. Well, okay. They also cleanse your mind once in a while. So, in any case, just because you don't have constraints doesn't make you free. It's what constraints, and specifically what eliminating what constraints opens up which capacities. For what? For positive, some notion of positive freedom has to operate here. Um, I would like to talk about Harry Frankfurt and his essay "Freedom of Will and Concept of Person," but I think I'll just make a separate, shorter video uh, discussing some of these quotes, and I want to further give you a kind of model for how to think about freedom. Um, but I'll make a separate video about this. Um, and post it separately so you can watch it kind of on your own time rather than as one. This video has gone on long enough. In any case, I'd like to thank you for listening. As I say, there's going to be a video response assignment, and 1 or 2 questions will be from this video. I really hope there's something valuable in it for you. Okay, thank you.